Well, I mean, this is the first seminar after the vacation, so you can see that everybody's relaxed. But okay. So, well, it's my pleasure to introduce and have here also Ciro Cattuto. We have been working together at the SI for quite some years. And he studied, he did a PhD in Perugia, in physics. And after that, he did a postdoc in the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Then he moved to Japan, to Tokyo region for another postdoc. And then back to Europe to La Sapienza in Rome. And after that, he moved to the ISI, and he's now he's now the deputy research director. And we're in the same group, but his thematics of work mostly are related to computer science and to analyze social networks and these things. And so I think that well, he's going to talk especially about some experiments with development with real people and face-to-face communication. This is your
Okay, thank you very much, José, for the introduction. I would like also to thank everybody here at the Sistemas, in particular Professor Miguel and Professor Hernandez, and of course Dr. Ramasco. We've been wishing to find ways to collaborate for a long time. Of course, I am very happy to be here moving forward next week this year. So this will be mostly a phenomenological talk about experiments that we do with actual people and with sensors on top of them. I will touch on a number of different points, so feel free to interact. It's nice if you interact while I speak, so maybe we can go deeper in specific points that you're interested in. I will try to keep it below 40 minutes, but I will add or cut things depending on the questions in order not to go over my time. And to make sure that works. So basically, I will tell you a bit how you measure networks of interaction between humans, where I will refer in the following to interaction as by meaning face-to-face proximity of individuals or user range proximity of individuals in space. We have to imagine people in an indoor environment. We will not speak on the geographic scale. We will be speaking of mostly indoor environments such as hospitals, schools, conferences, and the scales at which we will work will be of the order of meters, tens of meters, and seconds. So this is the finest scale at which you can approach behaviorally the movement of people in space. Then I will a bit tell you about a few stylized facts that you see when you start watching, you start analyzing this kind of dynamical social networks. These are networks that evolve in time, so they're temporal networks, they're typically multiplex networks because you have several different activities with a single edge. And then I will show you what this means for simple, very simple spreading processes such as the standard SI processes, SIR processes, and a few more realistic ones. And I will close by pointing to three main directions that we are exploring, which correspond to three main questions that we would like to understand better. So basically, the game is this one. You have a situation like this, like us in the room, and you want to turn this into a graph representation, where basically node is a person and two nodes are connected if the two individuals are in some specific spatial relation to one another. So from now on, what I will mean with contact or with interaction means that the two guys are close to each other, possibly facing each other. Okay? So this is really the finest scale at which you can explore this. Then, why do you want to do this? The first one is to really open a window on this scale of human mobility and proximity, which has been for a long time observed. We know a lot about mobility at the geographic scale. We know a lot about the mobility at the urban scale. What happens in indoor environments has been a bit foggy, basically because there hasn't been a lot of data around, with a few exceptions that I will mention. So we want to understand this. Of course, this bears relevance directly for epidemic propagation, especially for airborne diseases. If you catch cold, if you catch flu, then it is pretty much known that face-to-face proximity is important for the probability of spreading the disease. to somebody else, because basically as you speak, you emit, you eject some droplets that contain viral particles or material cells. There are a few open questions there, but without data you cannot really answer them. So that's what we set ourselves to do. Then there are a number of other fields that are impacted. I don't know if you are familiar with these keywords. They are very strong in computer science. Ad hoc network, delay tolerant network, opportunistic networks. The idea is that increasingly people live and work with a device like this in their pocket. And people are thinking of systems so that the devices talk to each other instead of going through a central network. Of course, what happens is that you are constraining what you can do by the fact that these guys are sitting on people. And so they are subjected to the mobility patterns and the proximity patterns of individuals. So people in computer science have been investigating this kind of networks experimentally to try and see what are the limits to what you can compute and what you can transmit on this kind of networks. And they have some early results. And then of course you have two domains. One is social network analysis, well established. Our take is a purely behavioral angle. We don't interview people about how they feel about their connection at a given point in time. We just put sensors on them and we only monitor the behavior, which is their position in space and their spatial relation to one another in space. Okay? So this is really important when you talk to sociologists, as you imagine, because otherwise if you say that what you're measuring is social network, they get upset and they're right, because you actually cannot qualify the sociality, you're just measuring the behavior of two persons in a specific spatial relation. And then of course you can go a little deeper and do organizational studies when you measure this stuff, for example, like in a company, and try to combine this information with organizational information, the hierarchy of the company, what you know about these individuals. So we play a big brother. We are not the first to do this. Actually, the first experiment of this kind was in Italy in the 90s. It was a very bulky device like this, probably not very scalable. It was using ultrasounds to measure the proximity of individuals. Then, of course, you're familiar with the work of Sandy Pentland at MIT, the reality mining projects. They created a sociometer, which is basically an embedded computer, also not very small, but very nice because basically it can measure the tone of the voice you're using, there are accelerometers, it measures how you move in space, and you can really go a little deeper in characterizing exactly what's going on between people. The limit of this is that because of the complexity of the device, it's a bit hard to scale it up. Okay? You cannot do thousands of it. There are other games that I will not mention. Just to tell you that there have been a lot of efforts on doing this from very different perspectives. And of course, this led to a huge amount of literature. As I mentioned, the geographic scale has been explored quite a bit thanks to mobility traces from mobile phones, but also the scale of the meters and the seconds has been explored a bit by using Wi-Fi technologies, by using Bluetooth proximity sensing in mobile phones. There are a number of projects going on. Some of them are also supported at the EU on trying to monitor human proximity and co-presence in rooms for epidemiological purposes to find nosocomial infections. And a lot of stuff done with old school surveys, which are very good stuff. But what was lacking when we started doing this in 2008 was that basically there was no large-scale recording of human contact networks done at large scale, so hundreds or thousands of persons, in a variety of contexts. So what we set ourselves to do was to create an atlas of human contact by measuring this stuff in a hospital, in school, in a museum, in a conference, and so on, and try to see what are the invariants, what are the universals, what depends on the context, and so on. So this is the mindset. We are creating an atlas for human contacts. We are constructing maps. And these maps, mathematically, are temporal vectors. Okay? So nodes and edges, and both entities are dynamic. So this is the collaboration that we set up. This is led mostly by me and Alain Barra at the ISI Foundation. There is Diego Normal in Lyon, the Baratz group in Marseille. And then very early on we partnered up with a small firm that manufactures sensors. These guys are really good at designing devices, and we started collaborating with them. And so what we did was to basically take one of their devices, which is actually, I forgot it. It's small, it's a device like this, roughly. And this is an active RFID. I will explain you what it means. And we basically forced this device by reprogramming its CPU to do something different, which was to measure proximity networks. And then since these guys liked what we were doing, they decided to support us more directly, and they modified the device in order to get the support of our machines. So this is not your usual RFID. RFIDs normally work like this. The active ones are basically radio. You have a small radio with a battery, and what they do is that they have an ID on board, and then every now and then, every few seconds, they send out a signal, they scream on a radio channel, hey, I am here, I am number 42. And then there is somebody in the environment, typically an antenna device like that captures the packet from, that's the capture, capture the packets of the air and sends it over a local area network to a computer where you give a representation of positions. In this case, what you do is location. Okay, you have no way of inferring mutual relationships. So if you do this, and we did, this is how a coffee break at the conference looks like. This was done in Torino, because I actually was here. So I remember me inviting people, talking that we were sensors. So you see, people here are in the conference room, they move to the coffee break area. This was Professor Vespignani chatting with a few guys, not going to the coffee, and when they eventually decided to go, everybody else came back. But you see, this looks okay, this looks cool, but there is a problem here that you can tell apart instantly. The stuff looks very much glitch. It's a blob. Everybody is sort of connected with everybody else. This means that deep down, we don't have a good proximity sensing strategy. We can do positioning, but that's not enough because the error on the position is on the order of a few meters. The errors on two persons sums up, which means that basically we cannot tell whether I'm actually facing this person or that person. Right? So we are not really sensitive. So in order to move this, we modify the device, and we use ultra low power radio frequency to sense proximity. So the device is now around the chest of people, you have to imagine. They transmit these very weak packets, and these packets can only propagate for 1 meter, 2 meters before they're washed away by the environmental electromagnetic noise. Also, we are working in a band which is a microwave band, which means that these packets are absorbed by your body. They cannot, and the packets cannot go through your body. So basically, you're shining a cone of radiation in front of you, and when two people are close enough and facing each other, packets can be transmitted from one device to another. So this is the basic process that we use as a proxy to measure face-to-face proximity. So when device 42 detects a packet from 17, now it sends out a message saying, I am 42, but I just saw nearby 17. So what we mine in real time is an edge between these two guys. Okay? And then we assemble the networks. I will not be able to the engineering details. There is a lot of engineering, as you imagine. But the point is that now this is how a conference looks. Now you see, those guys are all sitting in a room. This is a purely topological representation, so don't imagine to map in space. Those guys are sitting in a room, but they're sitting like you guys, so they're close to each other, but they're not facing each other, except that a few of them are talking to each other during the talk. Okay, so they're twisting towards one another. And then the coffee break times arise, and people stand up and start socializing, interacting, and slowly they move to the back area. Now you see that in this case you don't have this cliquish appearance that you had before. We can really resolve finely individual contact events between people. We are really in contact with face-to-face proximity within 1 meter and a half. Okay? The video is very long and very boring, but if you really want to see it, it's here. So basically, we can solve this problem, and we can do one thing. We can do this unobtrusively. This device is so small that people forget about it. It's embedded in the lecture. It's very reliable. We can work easily with 1,000 devices simultaneously, and we did it. And we have a very high spatial and temporal resolution. The limits, because not everything is perfect, right? The limits are that this is easy to do indoors because you need to have antennas that receive the signals. If you want to do this in a park downtown or over the sea, this is problem. These measurements are short term because they're basically limited by the duration of the batteries on the device, which basically puts a cutoff a couple of weeks, 3 weeks. Okay? And then logistics, because the hardest part when you need these experiments is really to give the tags to people to make sure that I can associate this to your identity, to collect the metadata, to manage the experiment. That's the real cost. The cost is not the technology, it's all the logistics of these things. That said, we decided to face the challenge. And so over the course of 4 years now actually, we ran a number of experiments. 10 more happened in 2012, 10 more of them are happening right now. But this is just to give you a sense of this idea of creating maps of human contacts in different scenarios. Like here we have a museum, and we mapped 30,000 people. This was a non-academic conference. This was a school in Lyon. This is an academic conference. This is an entire technology incubator, and so on. So we deployed this technology over and over and over, mapping different environments. Of course, every time partnering up with different people to support the logistics. And now I will show you quickly, in the next 10 minutes, a few stylized facts that you observe when you start looking at data. So let's start from the conference. The first one we picked was the conference whose title was Nothing to Hide, so it was perfect for us. We were like, hey, we have an and so we equipped 600 persons. Unfortunately, things didn't work well, so the device was manufactured with the defect, and the transmission range was very long. It was 20 meters instead of 1. Okay? As it turns out, this was useful because this is a reference case to compare other measurements to see what happens when you lose the spatial resolution and can only detect loose range proximity rather than face-to-face proximity. Because one of the questions is, do you really need to go that deep? Do you really need that level of resolution? And in that case, we can look at this data where that level of resolution is not allowed. Okay? Then we have an hygiene conference in Lyon, another conference organized by the European Semantic Web Organization. This was interesting because this was the first one where basically we asked people to link the ID of their device to their online social networks. And so basically what we created was a multiplex, a multi-layered network representation where we have simultaneously the proximity in space, but also the Facebook links, Twitter, the issues, their annotation, photoship, relationship, and so on. So you have several social networks, one on the other, and you can study what's the relation between them. Of course, there were fancy interfaces, but I will skip that. Okay, enough pretty pictures. Now let's go to the ugly pictures. This is the basic level of description. For example, this is the number of persons as a function of time in different contexts. And as you can see, of course, you see the circadian rhythms. You can also see that the geeks, the computer people, have very different behavioral patterns than the other guys, because here you see at a normal conference, people are there at noon, but they are not there at midnight. At a computer conference, people are there at midnight, and they're pretty much not there in the morning. So this is the largest conference, this is the very, very popular geek conference in Berlin. So it's active at midnight, not Saturday night. So you do have this heterogeneity, but so far, this is obvious, right? Things get a little bit obvious, but still a bit predictable for people with your background when you start looking, for example, at the distributions of the contact durations. So we measure how much a contact lasts, the individual contact, and then we plot the probability distribution. As you imagine, it's a broad distribution. I will not try to fit it with the log normal, with the power law-like distribution. It's obvious that it has to be broad. It's been known by now that human dynamics can be processed driven by human dynamics exhibit this kind of varsity behavior and heritage correlations. But there are a couple of things that are interesting here. The first one is that in different contexts, these are our offices at ISI, this is a very large conference, and this is the case where we don't have face-to-face resolution, we have very long range proximity only. What you see is that the distribution of contact duration obeys the same scale. Okay? It's pretty much the same. Of course, you start having deviation here, but they're mostly due to finite size effects. This was a much larger conference than the other. This is not obvious, and it's a good news if you're a model, right? If you want to model human contact and you want to introduce in your model an idea, a realistic idea of how contact duration is distributed, you can pretty much plug in this distribution, and we know that this distribution is very stable across very different contexts. So it's sort of a universal, it's sort of a stylized fact of human contact. Of course, that is the standard question. Does this heterogeneity arise because different people behave differently, or is it an intrinsic heterogeneity of individual trajectories of the person? And you can break it down, and what you see basically is that if you consider the contacts of individuals, of single individuals, they still are distributed according to the same broad distribution. You see that they pretty much collapse along the distribution for the entire social aggregate. You can also see that this stuff goes very fast to a stationary distribution. If you sample the first 12 hours of data, or the second 12 hours, or the entire data set, or just one person, you always get the same distribution, which means that you can measure this reliably if you have partial sampling. In these cases, we had something between 50% to 95% sampling of the population. But if you try and make the exercise, you take a data set with very high sampling and you decimate the data and recompute the contact duration distributions, you see that the distribution is pretty much robust, which is again a good news. It means that if you can only sample 30–40% of the population, you will still get the right distribution that you will measure for the entire population. Okay? So these are all very good news for modelers. Of course, these are relatively weak results because there is nothing shocking here. Okay? You expect this kind of things. It's a little more interesting the fact that you observe this collapse, that this stuff is so very robust. Okay? Of course, things are not like this if you go deeper. If you start looking at what people call concurrencies, these are the probability distribution of the interval between my contact with somebody and my successive contact with somebody else. And these, as you imagine, are a basic building block of causal processes on these kind of networks. So in this case, what you see is interesting, because you see that basically you still observe broad distribution, again, not so surprising. They still collapse, which is interesting, but when you don't have face-to-face proximity sensing, if you only measure whether we are roughly within 10 meters from the same room, you get a different distribution. And I can go deeper, that of course one has to make this statement more precise, the information is in these publications. But the point is that this tells you basically something important, which is it is important to measure face-to-face proximity, because if you're interested in modeling processes that are sensitive to the causal temporal structure of the contact network, having face-to-face proximity yields different distribution than not having it. Okay? And so if you want to be realistic, you need to get to that level. Then of course you can cross-grade the data, and I will be doing this a lot in the next 20 minutes, change scale, cross-grade, and different resolutions. Because you can say, okay, I don't care about time. Let's aggregate the entire network and build a weighted cumulative network of contact, where a node is a person, two nodes are connected by an edge, and the weight of the edge is how much time they spend in face-to-face proximity. Okay? So this was a small conference. This was organized by Vittoria Conizza, this was Vespignani, and these were 3 students who basically didn't interact with anybody else but themselves. So you can map out the interesting structure. If you dig a bit, you find what you expect to be in social networks. You find a high topological heterogeneity, you find a high weight heterogeneity of links. You find high clustering, you find a relatively small diameter, as you expect in social networks, very high number of triangles. You find evidence of homophily, links preferentially exist between individuals who have same features, here in terms of country they belong to, or the fact that they're senior researchers. So all of this can be done.
Country each where they are paid.
Sorry?
Country each where they are paid.
Country in this case was the primary affiliation. Yes. So for Vespignani it was the US. And for Vittoria at the time it was Italy, now it would be France. So basically the idea is that you can start exploring a bunch of problems that people have been doing in sociology by using paper-based surveys or interviews, and this is the objective part. You can answer different questions. It's not meant to replace the work of sociology, of course, it's just okay? But this is just to show you that this view provides valuable information. And then you can go still a little deeper, and in this case you find something surprising. This is the strength of a node, defined as usual as the sum of the weights of the edges inside on that node, as a function of the degree of the node. So purely topological property, which does not depend on the weights. And typically, if the weights are not correlated with the degree, what happens is that you expect a linear dependency of the strength from the degree. In these cases that we mentioned, regardless of whether you're sensitive or not to face-to-face proximity, but all the more if you are, you see instead the rather marked superlinearity of the weight with the degree, which is striking and has strong implication for immunological processes. It means that the total time I spend in contact with other people is not proportional to how many people I meet. It's more than proportional. So that it's a sort of multiplicative effect, right? The more I meet people and the more time I engage in every single interaction. So if I am more social topologically, I'm also more social in terms of strength of those things. I mean, I suppose I know this is an important property also in airport networks, and also in that case, it's got interesting implications. So this is just to show you some simple stuff that's a bit striking that you can derive from the cumulative network representation. Okay, enough conferences. Then, for example, let's take a museum. The museum, we are playing with these guys at the Science Gallery in Dublin. This is Michael John Gorman, the museum, the Science Museum of the Trinity College. And they're great, and they basically allowed us to set up a game where the device of somebody could be either infected or healthy. When it was infected, it was blinking very visibly. And then the infectious state would propagate via radio message to nearby devices. And of course, as you imagine, kids were loving this because they realized they could infect strangers and go there. These kind of things, right? And other kids were actually running away from the infected kids. So this was very fun. Then what happened is that during this exhibition, which lasted 3 months and covered 30,000 people, the H1N1 pandemic started. And suddenly we had like 30,000 visitors in just a few days, because this thing was very popular. Of course, this was a very simple thing. But the good side effect of this, as you see, they made it very scenic. The good side of this is that we got a lot of data. So basically, this is how a day at the museum looks like. Here you have to imagine that the bar clock is the hand of a clock. So the museum opens at noon and closes at like 6:30, I think. And you see that in this case, the structure is very different from the social network that we measured at the conference. In that case, it's very clustered together, it's very bundled. In this case, as you see, it's got the diameter is much longer than what you observe in a conference with the same number of persons. This aggregated structure is due to the fact that basically people stream to the museum. It's not the fixed community that stays there for 3 days. Now you have a community which is continuously renewed. The time people spend at the museum is not normally distributed, so there is somehow a typical time that you spend at the museum. You don't spend there 2 days, right? And this thing basically creates local dependencies due to copresence and create this aggregated structure. Okay? Here you can see guided tours. You see people who enter the venue at the same time. The color of the node is the time at which they enter. Okay? So this is a group in the morning, another 2 groups who didn't interact a lot, and so on. And then you get a number of interesting effects. I won't go into the details, but like the number of connected components during the day depends on the flux of visitors. Because if you have very high flux, you basically connect globally the network. If the flux is low, as you imagine, it breaks down into several different clusters. And of course, this has implications again for epidemic propagation. And we got this data for basically every day for 3 months. By the way, most of the data I will be speaking about are public. You can go to our website, download them. So if you want to play with that, I will be around for another 3 weeks. So if you want to do anything with this data, come to me and I give you the data. There are a few caveats. Some of the data on hospitals and other things are subjected to non-disclosure agreements, and I won't be able to share that. But most of the data we are sharing. We play in schools. Schools are cool because in schools you have one more ingredient. Now you have a global schedule. A conference is also scheduled, but you're still somehow free. If you are a student, you're not free. You have to be in this class until 1. Okay? And this guarantees you 2 important things. The first one is that there are clearly defined groups. Your nodes are labeled. The second one is that these groups have to move according to rules you know. And so this plays, this interplays with the structure of the social network within each class, which resembles the conferences, right? So they are interesting to study. As you imagine, schools are also very important for epidemic spreading. This is, for example, how a school in Lyon looks like. These are classes. They know that the center is a teacher. And you see what happens when they go to the playground, of course, they're all connected, because basically the class structure doesn't matter so much. Children interact with people from other classes. When they go to have lunch, they go in shifts, so you have different couple of classes that play. But basically this shows you that there is a multi-scale nature to these networks, right? You have the scale of the class with some dynamics, which is pretty much the same dynamics and the same invariants that you have for a conference. But then there is the scale of the entire school, where content is controlled at a higher level by the scale of the school. Okay? You can, again, consider the cumulative network. You can recover if you use standard community detection algorithms, the class structure, that's the obvious. But what's nice is that you can go a little deeper. You see here nodes are colored by gender. When the children are very young, they mix with one another regardless of gender. But when they age, this is a primary school. When they get older, the guys and the girls start creating separate communities. And you can actually measure this. I don't have time to go to show you the details, because there is a huge literature on this, so one has to be extremely careful. But basically, by using this data, we were able to find a couple of new facts on age-dependent gender homophily. You can really resolve new things by using this stuff. And then you can employ a compartmentalized representation of concept, where you use as nodes the classes. This is very commonly used when you do epidemiological studies, and you have labels for the nodes. You cluster them according to the labels, and you try to characterize basically the contact between the nurses and the doctor, between the children of one class and the children of the other. So this is how the class contact matrix looks like. Every cell is color-coded according to the accumulated for the entire class and for the entire experiment face-to-face time expressing units. This is the scale. And what you see here is the strong diagonal, which is basically class homophily. Notice that this is not measured inside the class. This is measured in the playground. So in this case, the community structure that you see here is not dictated by spatial constraint. It's not that me and you have to be in this room and the other guys in the other room. We are free to contact anybody else because we are all at the playground. But of course what happens is that the structure of the social network is reminiscent of the spatial constraint, to the school schedule, to the classes, to grade dependent and age dependent homophily, and so on, right? So you can see, basically, individual class homophily, you see that there are brighter 2x2 squares, and these are grade driven homophily, grade dependent homophily. This brighter block compared to these areas is due to the schedule, because these guys are scheduled to have lunch pretty much at the same time, on average, whereas the older guys have lunch at a different time. So you can see really a lot of structure that you can relate to several layers of complexity of the system. And then you can go one more step and go to another critical setting, which is hospitals, right? In the case of hospitals, what happens is that roles are known and they are very important because you take decisions based on those roles. There are rules. Of course, you have problems when you do measurements. You have to sterilize the tags, which means you have to seal them. You have to make sure that you do it fast enough so that the battery doesn't run out. It's tricky, but if you do it, and we did this actually in collaboration with the largest pediatric hospital in Italy, the Bambino Gesù Hospital, in particular the group of Professor Tozzi, you can create this kind of maps. So this is like a pediatric ward where they treat respiratory diseases, transmissible. Looks like. You have the different roles, nurses, auxiliaries. These are the guys who move stuff around in the hospital. Nurses, doctors, and then you have children and parents. This hospital only allows one parent for every children. And the thickness of the edge, as customary, is how much time they spend in face-to-face proximity. The color encodes temporal properties of the edge. So orange means a very stable edge. Whereas cyan means an edge which is flickering in time. So basically, you see that you have strong, stable, very selective connections, as you expect, between each parent and the corresponding children. And then all of this is wired with flickering connections to the rest of the hospital. You have a lot of role-based homophily. You see that these clusters are denser inside. These two guys work a lot together. And these two classes, actually the doctors consider these guys slaves, and so they don't even talk to them. So you can see that. So it's, and actually, no, I'm kidding now, but there is a reason in terms of protection from nosocomial infections. The interaction between these two groups are actually suppressed by the sun. You can look at the structure of role-based contact network. So you restrict the contact network to all the nurses. You see it's very much cliquish. And you see that, for example, the patient network is extremely different. It's basically patients are all isolated, which is again what the institution wants. We want patients to be isolated to one another because otherwise the infections will jump from one to the other, right? As you imagine, however, the fact that you have this structure means that if one of these guys transmit an infection here, then suddenly you have a problem, right? And that's the potential to go back, which is actually the kind of studies that we do on this. And then you can define also here contact matrices. These data are very rich. People typically have been doing this in epidemiology by asking just how many guys did you meet today? How many doctors? How many nurses? Maybe once a day, maybe once a week. Here you can really measure individual interactions, measure how much they last, how different they are, and so you can define not only, in a sense, the time these guys spent together, but how many times the contacts went on, how many distinct contacts you have. You can define very different contact matrices that can inform different aspects of epidemic planning. And this was something that made the doctor very happy, because basically the median of the face-to-face time between patients in their work is 0, which means that they are very successful in isolating children from one another. So, now in the last less than 10 minutes, I will point to 3 main differences in the 3 main problems that we are addressing that we consider important once you have this data. And they're all related basically to the high heterogeneous structure of these networks. Okay? Because we have machinery that produces temporal networks, and it is known, I mean, you have seen the article by Martin, but there are several other studies. Basically, the topology is highly heterogeneous, and this is known to have, as discussed, results by Palestiniani and Pastor Satora, so what happens here in the threshold. There is a strong heterogeneous weight. Again, you know that does have a huge impact, and there is work of Ciro on that. And you know that in this case, where you have a dynamic network, you are plugging in an additional layer of complexity, which is hemodynamics. So edges and nodes are subjected to heterogeneities, which amount to a non-Poissonian inter-even distribution, non-Poissonian activity distributions, power law temporal correlation. So these systems are very dirty. Okay, so modeling them is challenging. If you wanna think of minimal models able to reproduce a number of stylized facts, it gets very hard very fast. On top of this, everything is modulated by this synchronous global rhythms of daily and activities and so on. So the way we approach this is to use a sort of data-driven simulation framework. We take the measured data, say from the hospital, and then we simulate a dynamic process on top of the real data. Okay, so we don't model data. Data are fixed, it's landscape. Then we have a dynamical process which may mimic or not an actual epidemic. And we run this on top of the actual data. And we notice we don't do this in order to simulate epidemics. This is just a way to probe very fine temporal structure of the network. So we use, for example, in this case, I will show you an example. We use very simple SI process, basically it's a snowball accumulation of the contact network, in order to see whether we can detect the stuff that's not easily detected by using standard statistical techniques. Some things are obvious. As you imagine, if you consider the comparison between the fast paths, the spreading paths along the contact network, and the shortest paths, you will find that they are very different. If you have a static network representation, the invasion path, so So the number of infection events that you need to have between node A, who is initially infected, and node B, is basically the shortest one, right? If you have a temporal network, what happens is that this is no longer true because this happens, right? This guy is infected, you have a contact with B, you're infected, then you have a contact with C, you're infected, and then you have this contact. And if you're looking only at the cumulative network, which is what people have been doing traditionally, you would say that the path between two guys is on one edge, whereas actually the epidemic followed the longer path, right? So if you look at these kind of properties, what you see is that the distribution of the fastest, which is the circles, and the shortest paths on the network is actually very different. Okay? These are ugly figures, I apologize for that, but basically you see that they are both broader and they have a lower maximum. Okay? Then you can actually ask more difficult questions. In my context, it's important, especially in computer science, to understand what is the probability distribution of the arrival time of the epidemic. So if you have this SI process, imagine I want to get a message delivered to everyone. So every time I meet somebody else, I spread the message. Okay? Simple SI process. If you do this, this is the conference network. What you see is that probability distribution of arrival times of delivery intervals strongly depends on the injection time. So if I inject the message at this point in time, I get a completely different distribution than if I inject it at a different point. And this is due to the very high heterogeneous, temporal heterogeneous structure of the network. If I inject the message during the coffee break, of course I get instant spreading and then it rates. If I inject it during the night, of course I have to wait entire night until somebody gets something in the morning and starts spreading. Of course, this is a very bad news if you are a modeler because you cannot do anything with the distributions, right? So what can you do to do something better? The trick is to change the method. Instead of using wall clock time, so the simple that time in order to measure time intervals, you start doing things more clever. So in computer science literature, for example, it's very common to start measuring time from the time of injection of the message. Still very dirty, but doesn't look ugly as before. Or you can consider the time of the first infection event and start your clock. Yeah. Again, looks a little better, but nothing striking. What we have found actually is that if you introduce an activity-based notion of time, things get radically different. So this is a significant departure from the way you customarily model this kind of processes. The idea is that we give up the notion of the time which is equal for everybody of that clock. And what we do is that we define a time which is local to every node. Every node has on it a clock. And we define time so that the clock can only run when the node is in contact with somebody else. So when there is a chance of actually receiving the message. If you're isolated, of course, there is no chance of receiving the message and you freeze the clock. Okay? So we do something like this. This is the intrinsic time, this activity clock time. If you have a contact long 3 seconds with this guy, this clock goes to 3. Then these two guys have a contact at a 5 seconds pass, but this clock stays frozen to 3. And then this guy engages in another contact, and then you restart the clock and you go to time. Okay? So we break down time. Now every person has different notion of time. Okay? This is not a radically new idea. If you see the last review by Peter Holman, Yari Saramaki, temporal networks, there are some ideas in computer science called vector clocks that people have been adapting. But the nice thing is that if you do this, if you measure time by using these activity clocks, this intrinsic time, what happens is that epidemic spreading on a very highly heterogeneous temporal network now yields very simple, very robust distribution of arrival time that collapse on one another regardless of the injection time. So basically what you can do is that by suitably defining times in terms of activities, you can factor out all of this dirt that you have in the data and focus on the intrinsic property of the time. So this is the first step. We have no analytical results of this. This is fitted very well by a log normal. Again, we don't know what that means. So this is an open problem. The other thing is that people in computer science have been deriving and modeling contact networks of humans from mobility models. So you have a mobility model for meat in space, and then you simulate this for a number of agents. When they're close, you switch on an edge between those guys and you refer to them. So if you compare delivery times over networks created by using standard accepted models of human mobility, and you compare them with reality, what you see is that there are strong brutal differences, basically. You see that in terms of these activity clocks, all of the delivery times have an exponential cut, whereas the experimental data have a much broader power law-like behavior. I will not call that a power law. A much broader behavior for sure. When you can do your statistics, you see the differences are a very strong significance statistically. So the critical point here is that you don't see these differences if you don't use this metric. So if you use the standard metrics like the distribution of contact duration, the distribution of inter-contact times, everything checks out. So these things look like good models. But if you use an intrinsic metric based on a prototypical spreading process, such as an SI process, then suddenly you see a very marked difference, which has direct implications for epidemic spreading, because the SI process basically is knocking down to a number of other processes, right? Because it's the fastest you can possibly do. Okay. And if you look at the topology of the invasion tree, what happens is that basically the average out degree of the tree for the models and for the data is radically different. So basically what this means, and here I will stop, is that epidemic processes on temporal networks are useful not so much, not only to simulate epidemiological context, but also as deeper probes in order to unveil temporal properties of the network that cannot be detected by using standard simple statistical techniques. That this kind of intrinsic clocks can seem to yield a arrival time distribution that do not depend so much, that has to be checked, on the individual context. In all of our data, they behave exactly the same in hospitals, schools, etc. So it seems to be a very strong difference. So, of course, we need to check for more data sets for more situations, but it seems to be a very strong side this factor. That all of the accepted models of human mobility, random waypoint, truncated Levy-flight-based models, reproduce the simple observables like probability distribution, contact times, and inter-contact distribution, but fail miserably in if you check out this more advanced metrics for delivery times, which means that in modeling we need to go beyond inter-contact times. We need to start creating models that not only reproduce inter-contact time, but also some more complex observables. And as you imagine, if you start plugging in more complex dynamics instead of the SI process and SCIR process, things get much more complex. So I do have a few results, but I will only show if you have a specific interest in that direction. So I guess I will stop here. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thanks, Ciro, and for the student, he said something that I forgot at the beginning when I introduced you. So he will be here for a month, and he's upstairs in the 103, I think is the number of the room, so if someone wants to talk with him, we find him. So now, questions, we have a question.
Have you tried, this is a study on hospitals, conference, have you tried a full lifetime study of population?
We need a lifetime, right? So, no, you mean in terms of temporal span?
Yeah,
well, the longest we have gone, I think, is 3-4 months for a given community. But since we found very early on that you have very high stationarity of this kind of data, then we decided to keep things simple and keep the measurement time short. Most of these observables reach very fast relatively stable shapes. Of course, if you're interested in studying slow processes, such as, for example, if you're monitoring a company, how the roles of people are reflected in their behavioral social network and how this evolves over time, then you need to measure this stuff over 4 months. But we haven't done that. We've only done that in a technology incubator. We are still busy analyzing the data. But so far, the scale at which we focused is the scale of days to weeks. so scales that are relevant for social processes of the past kind, like information spreading, for epidemic spreading, it's basically simpler because the time scale of the process you're investigating matches the time scale of the data stuff. Of course, you can investigate what happens if you have a very slow epidemic, for example, but then you have to take risks. What you have to do is to take the data and start playing it back over and over. And if you do that, as you imagine, into the correlations, so the results are pretty taken. So the short answer would be that no, we haven't done this for extremely long time. Also because there are technical problems. At some point, the batteries are running out. We need to replace them. Replace them is a mess. We tried it a few times. So what happens is that the guys replacing them then start switching devices and suddenly things get very complex very fast. But yeah, in hospitals we do have right now a couple of things running where they want to have a long-term measurements to wait for air spreading in hands of nosocomial infections. And in that case, you have to sit and wait until something happens, and then you go back to the data you had for that moment. But as you imagine, this is very time consuming. So we are waiting for the technology to expand and this possible. Well, for the other thing that we are waiting for is the moment these devices will have a way of doing low power proximity sensing. In my phone will have an NFC sensor. NFC can behave similarly to what we have. If you do Bluetooth, you get this device will talk to the guys on the other side. So that's not good enough. But with NFC, we will be able to get those kind of data, and then you can piggyback the phone with having their pocket, assuming you can complete and install your app. So it's always tricky, right? So the good thing of hospital schools conferences is that they're all environments where you can somehow socially engineer the system and convince people to obey your program, right? In hospitals, as you mentioned, it's easier because that becomes all of the hospitals practically. And also people invade the privacy of patients so much in hospitals are tracking their locations compared to throwing blood. So hospitals are relatively easy, they have a high relevance, so we are running several studies there. School are another situation where it's relatively easy to work, despite the fact that kids, of course, are in concussion. But it's easy to work because it's easy to come up with either game dynamics or other incentives to make this work. And that's the direction that we would like to pursue, actually, to start having control games and start to see how the structure of the social network interplay with the game dynamics and like agreement, these kind of things. Yep.
Since we can
you mentioned multi-conferences, there was also Twitter accounts. You mentioned that Twitter account.
Yes.
So, did you, for instance, compare the network on Twitter?
Yes.
To the network issue of the accounts?
Yes.
And for instance, the interaction which you have.
Yeah, we did.
Twitter,
I didn't include this. Things are as you expect, right? The two are highly correlated. It's actually a bit depressing if you look at the data, because what you see is that at conferences, people basically spend time with their Facebook friends, or with their posts. I mean, that is obvious, right? All of these networks are strongly correlated, right? So what we did was to relate the co-authorship network with the Facebook network. We had tags from the issues from which you can mine communities of practice, and then a co-membership links in the communities of practice, and so on. All of these things are somehow related to one another. And then what you can do is set up the precision of your schema where you try to use one of the networks to predict the other. So if I know your Facebook friends, will I be able to predict who you interact with? But this has been done a bit, no? Crandall, others, Kleinberg did this for Flickr data. By basically predicting this is a PNAS paper that came out last year, where basically they predict the presence of a link between Flickr users based on the spatial and temporal coincidence of the photos they posted.
Okay. But this is okay. So.
But this is different. I agree. This is the scale. Also, that's a geographic scale we are working with yours.
But did you publish this
No, this is under review right now. So hopefully it will be. but yeah, these signals are there, and it's actually surprising that indoor contact patterns have such a strong resemblance in the online social.
Well, I think this is also well, it's maybe surprising that it's correlating so strongly.
Of course, all of these things are correlated. If I know your friends, I forget also the online social networks. Now, if I know your friends and I monitor your behavior in a disco, you are more likely statistically in your private friends. This is of course obvious, not because you will go there with your friends. That is the usual thing, and then also homophilia, the social influence, you open the door as well. But you know, this is like any other things also in sociology. One thing is to say I expected that. But then if I had told you the opposite, you would have said I expected. You know, that's actually how I'm about everything, right? So everything is obvious. And you measure it. No, okay, I understand you make this very well. Yeah.
So, but I said it's obvious. You just said that yours were surprised.
Yeah.
Etc.
Yeah, it's actually surprising if you look at the quantitative metrics, because it's really you get it very
Very nice.
You mentioned several times that the data you collect is complementary to what social scientists get by surveys. I mean, there are no social scientists here. So, in which sense data from surveys get something else that you don't get? I don't say in interpretation or in theory, data collection.
Well, for once, we discovered this the hard way in a sense. It's that a sociologist characterizes a social link far beyond the purely behavioral aspect. So, as physicists or computer scientists, we see a proximity relation that's a behavior, that's a social link. Things are not simple because in sociology they are used, for example, to consider the directionality of a link. I can qualify Jose as a friend, and he can qualify me as a colleague. There may be complex metadata about the edge that qualifies a relationship. But the basic thing I would say is that the worldview of one user doesn't have to match the worldview of the other, whereas by definition, our contacts are completely symmetric if I'm in contact because I was in contact. Behavior speaking, we are close behavior. So it's complementary in that sense. That all of this, I think, falls within the domain of behavioral social science, which is very close to what you can do on the web, right? Where you often can work at scale by using statistical measurements on large-scale digital traces of human behavior. But you don't get to talk to those guys and interview them and understand exactly what they wanted to do when they went here. So I think this is the gap methodologically between the two disciplines.
So those are different questions.
And I was coming to this exactly. In the end, you really ask these kind of questions because, of course, if you use the traditional survey-based or interview-based methods of sociology, you cannot scale it up to 2,000 persons. And studies in sociology are very legitimate to 20 people, right? We come from physics, so for us a large number is 10 to the 23. Actually, it's not a number, right? So 100, 1,000 is a small number for us. And of course, you can see this in the data because these data sets are very noisy. Because it's very hard. If you're interested in the structure of the data, it's a challenge, right? Because this stuff is nice, it's highly heterogeneous. But in the sense that I completely agree with you. You're really asking different questions, and it's complementary in that sense because you ask different questions that can come together. For us, for example, the example was the. Let me see if I have. Was really the homophily, the gender homophily, which has been studied to incredible detail by sociologists. And the agreed view is that, let me see if I remember, is that what happens is that you get more gender homophilous the more you age. So this is what we were seeing in the data. If you're young, you mix with one another. If you're young, if you're like below like 8, 7, you mix regardless of gender. As you age towards 10, 12 years, you start being gender selective. What we found actually, and this is something that you can find only by using these methods, is that this is true for the boys, but it depends on the strength of the link for the girls. So there's really, this is the person correlation coefficient between the grade, the age, if you want, and the strength of ties with the same gender. And so with boys, it behaves by the book. We are saying nothing new that the sociologists didn't know. For girls, actually, what we show is that for fleeting ties, for short contacts, actually it's the opposite. Girls get they get gender selective, but they establish fewer strong connections with other girls. Whereas when they're younger, there is still gender selectivity with age, but the weak ties are more politically discrete. So in a sense, they concentrate their social attention towards other girls, investing more energy in the strong ties. Whereas the boys do not display preference for the strength of the tie. They just spend more time with the boys, regardless of whether it's a casual interaction or a big fan or a close friend. Girls behave differently. This requires going down to the scale of contacts that last 2-3 minutes, which of course you cannot do with a database survey because people will not remember about the contacts, it only lasts 3 minutes. The other thing, and this is an interesting question that we are trying to address by setting up research projects with sociologists, but also with epidemiologists, is that we would like to have a context where you have simultaneously the objective data from the sensors and the surveys, and try to see what is good for what. You know, here there is a big problem in terms of, do you really need this much information? I mean, do I really need to know the measurement of tracing responsibility of 1,000 people in order to make through the dynamic model of the scale? Unfortunately, the answer is yes, but that depends on the question. Like if you, for example, what you can show, this is a work we published recently in the medicine, is that if you have a mismatch of time scales between the disease and the human dynamics, then you don't need the full temporal reconstruction. It's okay if you have a static snapshot weight. But if you don't have weights, you still get very bad answers. So the point and the overarching question here, for us at least, is given a dynamical process, what is the sufficient amount of information that you need in order to correctly model that over the temporal network?
A question which is related. You mentioned that the normal models of the B-flights are not good enough. Now, what mechanism do you have in mind that has to be taken into account in the model?
Yeah, there is we try to build this constructively. There is a paper by Ginasca Bianconi and Dallara where they try to play with our data and build a model which is centered on group dynamics. So the model is centered on how the system transitions from a clique of n persons to a clique of n plus 1 person. And by suitably creating a model for the attractiveness of groups in this context, you can reproduce more stuff than the standard community model. So it boils down to introducing additional correlations in the system that typically take into account the existence of triangular relationships or group structures or higher order cliques. But this is just one direction. It's really open. We don't have, honestly, we don't have at all a good model that can reproduce, for example, what we observe with these activity blocks. That's an open question. This is something that we are really telling modelers just in case they can come up with clever ideas that go beyond what we do.
More questions? Otherwise, thank you.
Yeah.